value, benefit, and time. And I hope to stimulate some provocative discussion that we can have near the end of the session. I have no relationships with the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm going to start, my first and last slide will be the same. These are the key messages that I think touch on some of the comments that John mentioned in his opening remarks. So I believe that there's a crisis in the value of cancer care, and it behooves all of us as members of the oncology and scientific community to collectively speak out about this and think about solutions. It was interesting, Dr. Eisenhower pushed me once in a conversation a few months ago to think about my mission statement. And my mission statement, I think, relates to points number 2 and 3 here. I want to imagine a world in which all patients, regardless of where they live, get access to the cancer therapies that really matter, the fundamental primary care, surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and palliative care that transforms lives and improves outcomes. Where you live should not influence your cancer care. And the flip side to that, or the yin and the yang, or the other side of the coin, is that I don't want to work in a health system that does things to patients, particularly near the end of life, that does not really help them. And I think that we've got an epidemic of marginal therapies and our patients expect better. And finally, as a corollary of that, patients want to know where and how they will spend their time during their cancer journey. So the first few minutes, we're going to talk about value. And these are the graphs and the figures that historically we've talked about. So we've spent a lot of energy talking about the outrageous price of cancer medicines. And this is work from Vinay Prasad's group showing an explosion in the price of anti-cancer therapies. This is now almost a decade old, but we now live in an era where the typical new cancer medicine costs between $150,000 and $200,000 US per year. This is another piece of work from our own group where we've tracked over the last decade, we looked at the financial statements. This was actually quite painful. I guess I should say I didn't look at the financial statements, but my junior colleagues did. We did an exhaustive review of financial statements over 10 years from the world's 10 largest pharmaceutical companies, and we classified their sales revenue as cancer medicine or non-cancer medicine. And what you can see here is the entire industry has shifted towards cancer. There's been an explosion. So while we've seen a 70% increase in sales revenue from cancer therapeutics, during that same time, we've seen the sales revenue for non-cancer drugs decreasing by 18%. So this is important because it shows you the astounding level of financial and economic pressures in the system. But I want to move a little bit away from price and cost, because that's what we've talked about a lot in the last decade. I think we need to continue to push back and speak out about outrageous prices. But I want to address the numerator in the value construct. This is the magnitude of benefit. So I conceptualize value as the relationship between how good is the therapy, what is the magnitude of benefit, and the denominator is the cost of that. And while individual oncologists and investigators should continue to speak out about the denominator, we actually have very little control over the denominator. But what we have entire control over is the magnitude of benefit. We are the investigators that design trials or put patients on trials. We write the guidelines, we inform policy, and we are the ones at the bedside having important discussions with patients. And I think we need to take ownership of the magnitude of benefit. So the way I conceptualize this is 3 key questions. What is the endpoint that was shown to improve? How much did it improve? And at the end of the day, do these 2 things matter to our patients? So we're going to go through these 2 entities in parallel. The first is endpoints, and then we'll talk about magnitude of benefit. So this is a paper I wrote now 10 years ago with Dr. Eisenhower when I was junior faculty, and she taught me most of what I know about progression-free survival. And we asked 10 years ago, is it meaningful or simply measurable? And it's astounding to me that 10 years later, we're still having this debate. And if anything, it's even more relevant in 2022. For those of you not familiar with the term progression-free survival, it's a composite endpoint of the patient being alive and or not having progression on imaging. So progression was described many, many years ago as a drug development tool in which is defined as a 20% increase on imaging and tumor diameter or the presence of new lesions. This was a really important tool designed to inform early phase clinical trials It was never designed to inform phase 3 randomized trials, and certainly not designed to inform clinical practice. So this is a classic slide from Ian Tannock, as he taught us in training many years ago. There are only two goals of any intervention in medicine, and that is to help patients live longer and to help them live better lives. Accordingly, the endpoints of phase 3 randomized trials should be overall survival or quality of survival. Anything else is a surrogate endpoint. Most oncologists, though, I think have lost sight of this. And this is another very provocative slide from Ian, where he asked, what should we call an agent that increases progression-free survival, has no effect on survival, and adds toxicity? I would argue that many presentations at ASCO next month will be defined by this statement. And Dr. Tannock would argue, and I would support that we should actually call these agents harmful. We should certainly not celebrate them as breakthrough therapeutics. I'll come back to that in a moment. So why has our field completely embraced progression-free survival? I'll show you some data shortly, but this is now, PFS is now the king of oncology. The vast majority of new cancer trials are designed to detect improvements in PFS, and 2/3 of new therapeutics approved by the FDA are on the basis of progression-free survival. There are some reasons why we might be interested in progression-free survival. There are certain circumstances where it might take many, many years to collect information on overall survival, and there is interest about the level of surrogacy. And I will say there are a handful of circumstances where it makes a lot of sense to use progression-free survival. However, that requires a valid and statistical demonstration of surrogacy, and in the vast majority of circumstances in which we see progression-free survival being used, it has not been found to be a valid surrogate for overall survival. So if we think about this now, there's a number of reasons why we might use it, but what are the concerns? Well, is progression-free survival a valid surrogate for overall survival? If so, we can use it. I'll show you later, but in many circumstances, that's not the case. The second circumstance we might consider using it as well, even if it's not a surrogate, does it matter intrinsically to patients? So this was a study we published recently, only 20 patients, pilot study. We're now building on this with the CIHR grant and nearing completion of 100 patients, a multi-center study asking the same questions. And so this was a study where we tried to get to the imaging, the level of imaging control, and does this have intrinsic meaning to patients? So what do patients think of progression-free survival, especially when we remove that third word, which of course can be very emotional for patients in a vulnerable state to hear the word survival. This is a pilot study, 20 patients who were already on palliative chemotherapy, so they knew what life was like on chemotherapy. We gave them some hypothetical treatments, and they had a discrete choice experiment. And we gave them a piece of paper that said, imagine your current treatment is no longer working. There is a new treatment that looks like this. Here's a piece of paper that describes the side effects, how often you'll be in the treatment unit. It's important, though, to emphasize in this hypothetical scenario that this treatment will not help you live any longer. What it will do is control the amount of time before your cancer grows on a CAT scan. We would like to know from you how much time of control on a CAT scan you would need to make it worthwhile to have this therapy. And it was quite striking. 17 of the 20 patients looked at our research associate and shook their head and said, are you crazy? There's no reason I would take this for any element of disease control if I'm not going to feel better or live longer. 2 patients said, yes, I would do it, but I would expect the CAT scan to be stable for, a year and a half or 2 years. We rarely see that. We live in an era of PFS gains of 2 or 3 months. And as expected, there's always an outlier. And 1 patient said that they would take any treatment for any benefit. But you can see patients generally are common sense. And if we use clear language, often they're the ones that point out that it's the oncologists that have lost the forest for the trees. So this is a piece that Elizabeth and I just wrote recently with one of our colleagues, Bishal Gawali and Michelle Tregear, where we have great concerns that I have fundamental concerns with progression-free survival at a number of levels, but one is the third word in that phrase, survival. And we argue it's time for a new name, and we write why, but we explain that it should probably be referred to as progression-free interval, to allow patients to make perhaps a more clear distinction between overall survival, living longer, and progression-free survival. So we've talked about potential reasons why PFS might be useful. Is it a valid surrogate? Does it have intrinsic meaning to patients? And I've shown you that there's reason to be concerned with both of those. But can we actually even believe the measurements of progression-free survival? And this was a piece that Ian and I just published with one of our biostatistical colleagues, Greg Pond, in JAMA Oncology last month. And in this hypothetical scenario, we have a drug which has no tumor activity and no benefit. But as expected, it has some side effects. And because of informative censoring, you can see this hypothetical scenario on the left. When there's no censoring, there's no side effects, you can see there's zero signal of improvement in progression-free survival. But when we account for the fact that all drugs, especially experimental drugs, will have side effects, and there will then be unequal dropout between the experimental arm and the control arm, you can see with informative censoring, with no change in the activity of the drug, we can create an artificial improvement in progression-free survival. And this is very likely to explain a number of new therapeutics that have been written about, including everolimus for breast cancer and others. So we live in a world where progression-free survival probably isn't a surrogate for many things that matter to patients. It probably, for most patients, imaging control on its own in the absence of quality of life doesn't mean anything. But even if we assume those things, there's major reasons to be concerned based on this experiment and other forms of bias that we probably can't even believe a proportion of the benefit we see in PFS. So that's an overview of some initial thoughts about endpoints in the value paradigm. Let's talk about effect sizes. This is a famous paper published by Tito Fo and his group now almost 10 years ago. They looked at 71 drugs that were approved consecutively over a period of 12 years by the FDA for solid tumors. During this era, there were clearly a few blockbuster drugs. The problem is our community does not do a good job of distinguishing the true blockbusters from the other drugs that are perhaps more modest or even marginal. So if you look at all drugs, you can see the median improvement in overall survival was very modest, 2 months. This is a piece of work we published several years ago with colleagues from my sabbatical in India, as well as colleagues in Canada and the UK. We looked at a series of systemic therapy trials in breast, colorectal, lung, and pancreas cancer. We had about 300 studies. You can see the principle of equipoise is alive and well. About half of trials were so-called positive, meaning they met their primary endpoint. When we took those positive trials and we applied the ESMO magnitude of clinical benefit scale, we found that only 31% of so-called positive trials met the ESMO threshold for clinically meaningful benefit. This translates to meaning only 15% of all trials. So you can see we have a tremendously inefficient research ecosystem, whereby many trials, even if they're positive, are identifying very small benefits that would not meet ESMO's threshold of being clinically meaningful. This is a follow-up piece by the same team using the same cohort, and we asked, I think, a fairly practical question. Most of us in our day-to-day lives understand there's a relationship between the price of something and its value or benefit. So if Dr. Tanek wants a new bicycle and he wants to ride even faster than his friends, he might be willing to spend more money on a bicycle because it will be faster and make him look better on his bike rides. If you want a bigger house, you spend more money. We asked whether that relationship exists for cancer medicines, and we found that not only is there no association between the magnitude of benefit and drug cost, you can see, if anything, there's an inverse relationship whereby the drugs with the smallest benefit have the largest price tag. So clearly, the cancer pricing ecosystem is broken and in need of a major overhaul. So those were some initial thoughts about value and the crisis in value, but let's look at clinical trials to understand where we've come from and where we are going in the value paradigm. So this is a body of work we call the evolution of the randomized controlled trial. The backstory here, the first paper was published in 2008. We did an update in 2012, and just last year we published the most recent iteration in JAMA Oncology. It's a story best told over a beer, but this entire journey started when I was a young oncologist working with a younger medical oncologist named Dr. Tanek, and I presented a case to him and he challenged me on something that led to this project. In any case, We have used the same methods to track clinical trials now over more than 40 years. We published the first piece looking at evolution of the clinical trial in the era of cytotoxic therapies. We did an update looking in the early era of targeted or molecular therapies. And most recently, we published looking at clinical trials over the last decade, in which we call precision oncology era. So the RCT became the gold standard in oncology in the 1970s. And so we've looked over time at systemic therapy trials in the major cancers, breast, lung, and colorectal cancer, published in the major journals. We wanted to look at high impact, widely read, practice-changing clinical trials. So in the most recent update, we had 300 RCTs published in those journals across the 3 major diseases over the last decade. This is probably one of the most important take-home messages. So you can see, tracking our cohort over the last 45 years, you can see some important trends. The first is the primary endpoint. Initially, they were doing tumor measurements, and then we went for response rate. Then we went up to overall survival being the king in the 80s. And you can see overall survival has now fallen away. Only about 1/3 of trials in oncology are primarily designed to detect improvements in overall survival. But you can see what was old is now new. They used to measure with calipers response rate. Well, now we call it something fancy, progression-free survival. And this is now king. More than half of clinical trials are now being designed to detect improvements in progression-free survival. And as we talked about earlier, there are some major reasons to be concerned with that. The other thing we've seen over time, trials are getting bigger, and you can see we now live in an era where 89% of systemic therapy drug trials in oncology are funded by the pharmaceutical industry. This obviously has a whole host of implications for our field. What else did we learn? We found that trials which have palliative intent are more likely to be positive or meet their primary endpoint than adjuvant or early stage clinical trials. Amongst palliative trials, we can see here, people who design trials, that they're doing this for a reason, but trials which use progression-free survival are almost twice as likely to be positive or meet their primary endpoint than overall survival. When we do see improvements in overall survival, amongst those trials which are positive, you can see the gains, they're modest. Consistent with Tito Foho's work of about 2 to 3 months, we're seeing in the range of 3 to 4 month gains in overall survival. So what can we learn from this last decade of clinical trials? Industries now funds almost all clinical trials in oncology. What about all the important questions that are not of interest to industry? And I should pause for a moment and acknowledge and say I'm not advocating for a clinical trial ecosystem which has zero industry involvement. Many of our very, very important trials and therapeutic advances come from excellent trials led either by industry or in partnership with our cooperative trials groups, but the pendulum has swung too far. What about all the trials that matter to patients which have no interest to industry? Diet, exercise, meditation. What about de-escalation trials, or how we can deliver therapy closer to home in a more convenient way for patients? We've seen a big uptick in the use of medical writers. I'll leave that later. That's something that gets Dr. Tanek worked up, and it should. We've seen that PFS is now king. These trials are also more likely to be positive, and remember that PFS is generally not a valid surrogate for overall survival. We've seen as well that even when there is an improvement in overall survival, the gains are modest. Now, I don't want to minimize the gain of a 2 or 3 months improvement in life for patients, but this comes at a cost. Obviously, there's cost to the health system, but most importantly, it comes at a cost to patients in their side effects, quality of life, and their time. And we're going to touch on that in a moment. There's also the context about this gap of between efficacy, outcomes observed in clinical trials, and effectiveness, outcomes observed in routine practice. And as we wrote about a couple of years ago, in almost every study that has followed up a clinical trial, we see that outcomes and benefits in the real world are smaller. And that's because patients and health systems and their care providers in the real world are very different. So when we see these gains of 2 or 3 months in the clinical trial, it's almost certain these are attenuated in the real world, and in some cases might be approaching zero. So this leads to something that we've called time toxicity. And this was a piece we wrote. It was led by my former fellow, Adam Fundaitis, where we ask, have we forgotten in oncology about patients' time when we consider therapy? And I'll just paraphrase here. Time spent pursuing cancer treatment in waiting rooms, emergency rooms, and the chemotherapy unit is time that cannot be spent fishing, traveling, or visiting with loved ones. This trade-off, of course, becomes most pressing near the end of life when time is short and many treatments offer small benefits. The time that we might invest in a therapy that has a large benefit and when the patient might live for many years, that amount of time proportionally probably is a worthwhile trade-off for many patients. But when someone has 6 months or 12 months to live, the time paradox becomes really important. Incredibly, oncologists do not discuss this very often. It's really not part of our culture. We also don't have evidence from randomized trials to help inform these conversations, but patients want to know this. And I occasionally will be asked by someone, typically it's a very pragmatic patient, the one I'm thinking of now, it was a farmer, who would look at me and say, okay, this treatment for pancreas cancer might help me live a few extra months, but am I just going to spend those months waiting around in clinic or in the chemotherapy unit when I could be at home with my family? And it is possible that some of these small gains in survival may in fact be offset by time spent in clinic and hospital. And I'm not proposing, I'm not providing judgment or drawing a line in the sand to classify a time trade-off as being appropriate or inappropriate. That's up to a patient to make that decision. But I think as an oncology community, we have failed to generate information for these patients, and we've certainly failed to discuss this in a meaningful way with our patients. We need to provide the information to empower them to make decisions about how they want to live their lives. This was a follow-up piece just published, I think, last month, led by young Arjun Gupta, an emerging oncology star in Minnesota, written jointly with Dr. Eisenhower and myself, where we conceptualize time toxicity and offer a proposal that going forward, all clinical trials should measure this. We measure with obsessive detail blood test results and tumor measurements. We could, in a very simple way, classify patients' lives going forward on protocol as either a home day, a day that they're at home enjoying time with friends, family, and their hobbies or working, or a day where they have to leave their home to seek healthcare. And you can see here, this information could be very helpful for patients. So a patient who's deciding between option A, which is chemotherapy, or option B, which is focusing on palliative care or symptom management only, while option A might help them live a little bit longer, you can see they might actually have more days spent at home. And so this is information that we can generate with time toxicity to help patients make a decision that is best for them. I want to spend a couple minutes just talking about the global paradox about cancer care before we move to, I think, hopefully some solutions and then a discussion. This is another bibliometric analysis we did, also published last year in JAMA Oncology. We looked before the evolution of the randomized trial was only drug trials into 3 major diseases in big journals. We decided to look more broadly, and we looked over a period of 4 years at every oncology RCT testing surgery, radiotherapy, or drug. We classified trials based on where they led by a high-income country or a low to middle income country. And we found that 92% of clinical trials are led by high income countries. We have to remember that 2/3 of global cancer deaths take place in low and middle income countries. There's some interesting observations here. Compared to trials led by high income countries, those coming from lower resource health systems were smaller. And they're more likely to meet their primary endpoint. They're smaller because I don't think they have the luxury to design mega trials to detect trivial differences. They are more pragmatic in their design. And in fact, that's found by the next point. You can see amongst the positive trials, the magnitude of benefit from trials led by our colleagues in low and middle income countries was larger. This was something that came out, though, was what we call publication bias. And you can see, despite the fact that there's some reasons that we should probably pay more attention rather than less attention to trials from our colleagues in LMICs, you can see that trials from LMICs are much more likely to be published in low impact journals. In fact, even when we stratify for whether the trial was positive or negative, you can see evidence of a publication bias, whereby a positive trial from an LMIC is still published in a much lower impact journal than a negative trial from an HIC. So some key findings from this overview of global oncology RCTs, we see it's dominated by high-income countries. I did not get into it, but we can see that cancers of poverty are massively underrepresented: cervix cancer, esophageal cancer, liver cancer. Most clinical trials are funded by industry and are looking at drugs in the palliative setting. Only 13% are testing new innovations in radiotherapy and surgery. And as a medical oncologist, even I can recognize we need to show some humility and recognize that most patients in the world that are cured of cancer are cured by radiotherapy and surgery and not by our drugs. The use of alternative endpoints is pervasive. Again, only a small proportion of trials are finding meaningful benefits. And then this problem where we need to pay more attention to the science and the efforts of our colleagues in LMICs, who in some ways are more pragmatic than us and maybe designing trials that can have larger benefits for patients. So the last piece of the puzzle here before we start wrapping up is we've talked about some of the low value problems in our field, but is high value care even accessible? So this is a piece written with Bishal Gawali and our dear colleague in London, Richard Sullivan, where we write about this concept Bishal has popularized, the cancer ground shot. And while we need moonshot initiatives to define, high-tech, big science to identify therapies for patients in the next 10 or 20 years, we also need to pay attention to what's happening on the ground. And in fact, we could arguably save more lives in the next 5 years if we ensure that patients get access to the treatments we already know work. So this is a piece we published last year in Lancet Oncology that comes out of work done by a number of us that are involved with the WHO Essential Medicines Working Group. The essential medicine list is updated every 2 years. It compiles the most important medicines across all diseases that should be available to all patients in the context of universal healthcare system. This list has policy relevance largely in low and middle income countries to help guide policymakers to determine which drugs they should spend their money on and provide in the public system. It's most relevant in those health systems that do not have their own process for health technology assessment. So we launched this study, which was effectively a global survey to address a few questions. We wanted to move beyond a boardroom in Geneva with a bunch of experts. We wanted to go to the front line and ask frontline oncologists, which cancer medicines do you believe are the most important? And then we wanted to compare to see, well, does the essential medicine list match what frontline doctors think is meaningful? And then move beyond that and say, okay, now that we know which treatments are most important, can you actually get these on the front lines of clinical care? And to do this, we did a survey and we used a thought experiment. It was a desert island thought experiment. In many ways, this came out of a conversation with Dr. Eisenhower years ago. And this is a thought experiment we've probably all done before at dinner parties. Imagine you were moving to a desert island and you could only bring 3 books. What would those 3 books be? Imagine you could have dinner with any famous person in history other than Dr. Eisenhower and Dr. Tannock. Who would that person be? And so here's the hypothetical question. Imagine your government has put you in charge of selecting anti-cancer medicines for your country. You can choose anything, but only 10 medicines. And these 10 medicines will be available to treat all the cancers in your country. Assume that cost is not an issue. Which drugs would you recommend to your government to achieve the greatest benefit for the most patients? And so we moved this forward through the working group that I'm involved with at the WHO. And like many of my projects, the science was fairly simple. The logistics here was very complex. In any case, we ended up getting responses from almost 1,000 oncologists in 82 countries. This was a Herculean team effort. About 2/3 were from high-income countries and 1/3 were from low, middle, and upper middle-income countries. When we ranked the drugs, that were put in this suitcase to move to the desert island, remember only 10 drugs per suitcase, but we looked at which drugs were most frequently taken to the desert island. We ranked them and we looked at the top 20. Amongst the top 20 essential medicines, most of them are old-fashioned drugs. 2/3 of them were approved by the FDA more than 20 years ago. The vast majority are old chemotherapies, cytotoxic agents, or hormone drugs we've been using for a long time. It was also reassuring to see that 19 of these 20 drugs were already on the EML, and there was a lot of convergence across health systems. Oncologists worldwide could agree, and 15 of the 20 drugs were identical across different health systems. So here's a list globally of the top drugs, and you can see here no surprises here. This was pretty pragmatic. Doctors wanted access to doxorubicin, cisplatin, Taxol, carboplatin, 5-FU. You can see some of the newer, fancier, expensive medicines, but it's generally the ones that have large benefits. Trastuzumab, Pembrolizumab was driven by high-income oncologists. You can see rituximab and imatinib. So it wasn't that we were shying away entirely from new and expensive drugs, but the new expensive drugs that made this list were the ones that have large benefits. Here's the problem, though. Despite the fact that most of these drugs were old, cheap, generic chemotherapy and hormone drugs, when you look at the proportion of oncologists that said they could get this universally for all patients, you know, well under half in LMICs, a bit higher in high-income countries, even in UMICs, even in high-income countries, universal availability for these old generic drugs was much lower than we would like. When we flip this and we say, well, if you could get this drug, what's the risk of financial catastrophe? And you can see here, depending on the drug, but you know, up to 2/3 of oncologists in LMIC said, look, I can get these drugs, but it's going to cause financial catastrophic ruin for my patient. You see a dose response here, a bit lower in UMICs, but even in high-income countries, you know, these drugs are generally very, very old, and up to 9% of oncologists were saying, I can't get these drugs without financially ruining my patient. So let's look here. This is from LMICs. Doxorubicin, it's been around for decades, should really cost, you know, pennies or a few dollars per week. Only 1/3 of oncologists could get it universally for all patients. 1/3 could get it with significant financial toxicity, and about 1/3 could get it, but it would cause financial ruin for their patients. Let's look here at trastuzumab. 15%, you know, it's biosimilar available now. Only 15% of oncologists said they could get it for all women in their practice. 15% they could get it with financial toxicity. 2/3 of oncologists said they could only get biosimilar trastuzumab with risk of financial catastrophe for the patient and their family. So this obviously has huge policy implications for our field. The first finding is that the essential medicine list is a pretty good reflection of the drugs which matter most to clinicians. However, we found that the list itself, we failed to move beyond the list because at a policy level and a drug pricing level, we have not prioritized this and it's not available. So even the basic cancer drugs, which are old and should be inexpensive, are not available. In this context, how could we imagine adding new expensive medicines to the essential medicine list if we're failing to ensure that cisplatin, doxorubicin, and trastuzumab are even available? So in the closing comments here, I just want to offer some insights. This is a piece I wrote with one of my other mentors, Dr. Detsky, when we asked the questions, well, why do patients get drugs that have such small benefits? And we've conceptualized this from the patient perspective, the oncologist perspective, and the system or the pharmaceutical industry perspective. So from the patient level, I think all of these are at least partially true, if not entirely true. I believe oncologists fail routinely to accurately convey the magnitude of benefit of our therapeutics. So I believe patients are starting treatments because the information may not be properly shared. Or if we share it, we might use confusing language, complex terminology. So I think that we can do a better job of explaining things to patients so they can choose whether or not they want to embark on these treatments, which some of them arguably have very small benefits. I also think that there's an element here, the patient, everything feels out of control in their life. They've been told they have a terminal diagnosis. Initiating therapy, even with small benefits, allows them to have some control. We've also learned from the economics literature that something called prospect theory is also driving this. Prospect theory, I'm going to butcher this, but in short, it means that human beings are hardwired to do things because they don't want to miss out on a small chance of a big benefit. That's why human beings purchase lottery tickets, but prospect theory would explain that patients will accept therapies because they don't want to be the 1% of people miss out on that chance of having large benefits. And I think a huge amount of this is driven by unrealistic expectations because the front page of our newspaper overhypes drugs. Now you could move upstream. Where do the journalists get this hype? They get it from the oncologists and the institutions who are overhyping in media releases. So I think we need to take some ownership there. So the physician, I think all of us go into medicine, we want to help people. We are trained to respond to a problem with an action. Sometimes it is easier to, when breaking bad news, instead of saying we should probably stop, it's easier to say, well, the CAT scan shows things are growing, but we have something else, let's try that. We're human beings too. We have feelings of guilt and inadequacy, and sometimes it becomes easier to move on to a therapy instead of having an honest conversation about the fact that maybe the best thing to do now is focus on symptom management. And of course, we have the pharmaceutical industrial complex. Their mandate is to sell as much drug as possible at the highest possible price. And I think we have to recognize that and be upfront about that. Where we run into problems is their profound influence on the system. They control the research agenda. They are able to influence the media narrative. They influence oncologists, practitioners, and people writing guidelines. That's a whole nother lecture, but we need to address the elephant in the room, which is the oversized influence of the pharmaceutical industry. So where will we find solutions? I think we need to start with conversations like this. I think we have honest discussions within our field. Years ago, it was only a handful of people having these discussions. I hope that group is growing, but we have to have these discussions in our field. We have to have honest discussions with patients and the public. We need to invest even a small fraction of the money we spend on pharma trials. We need to invest in qualitative research to understand patients' values and their preferences, how they want to spend their time, and understand societal and public preferences. What I do know is the status quo is not sustainable for health systems, nor is it in the best interest of patients. I'm going to leave you with one last thought experiment. I call this the last 6 months of life paradox. And as an oncologist looking after someone who has about 6 months to live, I can tell you it's actually fairly easy for me to prescribe a toxic cancer drug that will cost the system $100,000. That drug will shrink tumors on a CAT scan for a period of time, but probably will not help my patient live longer. However, I live and work in a health system where while I can prescribe that drug, it's almost impossible for me to mobilize the supports at home to allow a patient with terminal cancer to live at home with good nutrition, adequate nursing support, and a community around them. It's almost impossible to arrange that. And so I think we really have to recalibrate our priorities and think about what is it that we want to achieve and what can we do to best help patients at the end of life. And I think when you imagine that the amount of talent and energy within the oncology community, I'm hopeful that we can encourage and stimulate the next generation to tackle these fundamental problems. And I think we should encourage them not to spend their career working on marginal gains, but to address these really, really big picture issues so that we can truly advance care for our patients. So just coming back to my last slide here, the key message is, I think there's a crisis in the value of cancer care. It's more than just the price of drug, it's the magnitude of benefit and the endpoints. I think we need to work towards a world where all patients in all health systems get access to the treatments which really matter. We should not settle for marginal therapies. Our patients expect better. And part of this is we need to generate data and have honest discussions with patients so they can make decisions about how and where they will spend their time. Thanks again for the opportunity to share these thoughts today. Look forward to any questions in the conversation. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was terrific. And we'll open up to questions. I mean, just a little anecdote. I remember at the Christie Hospital in Manchester, a survey of what people thought was important during the last period of their life was to have better parking for the hospital, because they spent so much time looking for a parking place. That was a big surprise to everybody. So let's go, first of all, Francois, I think you've got a question. You were waving your hand.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you very much, Chris. It was extremely interesting. I just wanted to elaborate on your last set of slides where you discuss, in fact, the responsibilities of the different actors in the system. So the patients, the clinician, and the pharmaceutical industry. It seems to me that regulators, and when I say regulators, I mean regulators across the world, whether you are talking about the FDA, the EMA, have a lot of guilt in this situation, because they tend to approve, to give a market authorization to let's say any product which shows some kind of efficacy, regardless of the magnitude of the effect. So, and I must say, HTAs as well, like us, are quite guilty, because we also recommend products with marginal clinical benefits for use in the NHS. What is your view on that? And do you think that there is a lack of incentive from regulators for companies to develop good products because they know that eventually they will get a market authorization.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I mean, you raise a great point. If I was, the CEO or a chief officer of a pharma company, you can imagine if your goal is to generate as much profits as possible, then you want to identify a drug that it just has to cross the line. It just has to be a little bit better than the other one. You want to have the broadest possible patient population, and you're going to crank the price as high. It's not rocket science why this happens. I think you're right. Our regulatory system has failed because it's allowed this to happen. And I think it's a long discussion why the regulatory system does this, but I think the people on the table are also human beings. They're vulnerable to some of the things we talked about. But I think there's also tremendous pressure, not just from pharma, but from the oncologists, I think, who need to maybe perhaps be a little bit more mindful about what they're advocating for, and also the patient voice. And I think the problem is that the narrative in many patient organizations is more drugs faster. And I think there's a number of reasons why that might happen, but I think, again, we have not done a good job as oncologists in articulating the difference between some of these drugs. And we need to help patients recognize that, patients want timely access to drugs, but they also want access to drugs that really work. So I think it's going to take really a societal conversation. It's going to start within oncology, but move out into the public and the patient space as well before we can fix the regulatory environment.
Chris, we were talking a little bit before we started about ASCO, and I was asking a naive question whether there is a policy session at ASCO, because obviously you're publishing much of this material and it should be educating oncologists, but it's not sufficiently. So how can we pressure the big meetings, the ESMO meetings, ASCO, to really expose what is going on here and what you've talked about tonight?
I think it's coming. I mean, I think ESMO and ASCO made a big advance 5 years ago when they came out with their value framework. So I think it's on the radar now. I think the problem is the financial incentives, especially in the US, are completely counter to anything that I've talked about today. But I think there is growing recognition that this isn't good for patients, and it's not going to be sustainable in any system, including the United States. So I think we need to recognize we better get our act together, because otherwise it's going to get to the point where it's going to be someone else in the financial space who's going to make decisions about what treatments are and are not available. So I think we can do a better job. I mean, Dr. Tanek might have some thoughts on this. He's done a lot of work with ASCO leadership and has been instrumental in kind of promoting the concept of high value care. Ian, do you think we're making strides with ASCO?
I think personally that they've stepped back. They had that value system come out a bit over 5 years ago, but there's been silence. I actually think ESMO is doing a much better job than ASCO in promoting that. So I don't think that ASCO is taking the lead that it should. And of course, these large societies are hugely supported by pharma. So there's always this balance that between the people who want to make changes and then the people who say, yes, but we need that support. But I think the FDA and the EMA are largely to blame, although even there, so Francois said, the regulators, the FDA is forbidden by its mandate. It's to discuss things like price, but they could set harder barriers to get better drugs. But if anything, they're moving the other way. So I think it's a little sad.
Yeah, no, I think so too.
John,
I see Richard Sullivan's on the call. Professor Sullivan, do you have any thoughts about kind of the European context? Do you think there's any more progress there than in North America?
Maybe I'll comment about that in a minute, but Lydia had her hand up before me. Not maybe with a question, because I've actually got a question for you, believe it or not.
Oh no.
Go to Lily.
Okay, I have a very practical question regarding the overall survival endpoint. As you know, we support non-commercial trials, but collecting overall survival makes them very much more expensive sometimes, because the trial will last much longer and you cannot end your trial officially. Can we think of a clever way to collect overall survival data in a context where you have an intermediate stop of your trial and you have a different cost for collecting the overall survival data, which in the current health systems are collected anyway. And yeah, I'm discussing this with Gauthier Bouja, our director of clinical research, and we always end up with PFS just for practical reasons.
No, it's a good point. So I think obviously in the adjuvant context, the follow-up for overall survival is a real problem, especially in a disease like breast cancer. I think my colleague Annette Hay and others here at Queen's and the Canadian Cancer Trials Group have actually done some work linking clinical trial data sets to real world data to see if they can leverage some of the population level data that's routinely captured about health utilization and survival status. So I think there are opportunities there. I guess the other thing I would just gently push back and say that at least from a regulatory approval point of view, most drugs are approved in the palliative setting. And they're often approved when someone's only going to live for 12 months or 6 months or 18 months. And so I would argue that I think Elizabeth, as usual, was already ahead of me thinking about this. I don't think we need to wait that long to get overall survival data for the vast majority of clinical trials.
Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, Chris. So I guess maybe it's a challenge back into the research ecosystem for systemic therapies. So Lex and I were at a meeting in New York the other week, and it was as you rightly said, it's unbelievable. Even the big funders, Blue Shield, Kaiser Permanente, are getting significantly worried now about the runaway costs as they're being demanded to cover more and more. But something that cropped up during the discussions was that there seems to be a fundamental problem within the research ecosystem. So as he pointed out, getting funding for doing the sort of trials where you're doing dose reduction, dose holidays. He mentioned about, for example, the neoadjuvant studies looking at IPI and NIVO for palpable malignant melanoma. I mean, he was basically saying that, 30% of patients that respond and get a complete pathological response don't need surgery and don't need adjuvant therapy. Massive cost savings. But there isn't a research culture within systemic therapies that asks those sorts of questions. Is how can we refine? How can we reduce the dosing? And I think, and maybe Ian will remember this, there was a real hoo-ha around the reduction of trastuzumab, wasn't there, with that trial that a lot of people just didn't want to face up to at all. And I guess the question is, how do you change medical oncology culture that says, fine with the new discovery science, but how do we also have an embedded culture which then looks to refine and reduce the use of these systemic therapies?
I know. I think Elizabeth, I wish you get Elizabeth to comment. She's put some great comments in the chat, but I think there's a disconnect. I mean, it's silos, right? I mean, the Ministry of Health is siloed from the research funders, and that's tragic because one of the reasons to do research is to benefit patients and the system. And I think there is, you often hear, oh, it's, the other thing I'm big on these days is having built my career largely in using real world data. I'm terrified by the fact that people now seem to think we can abandon clinical trials and just use real world data, which is a total disaster. And people say, oh, clinical trials are too expensive. Well, how can we afford not to do these, both at the patient level to ensure they're getting care that makes a difference, but also from a societal level, because the amount of money we might be spending on drugs that actually don't help patients is going to be far greater than the investment in a well-designed, rational clinical trial. Elizabeth, can you share your thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say that actually, at least in our context, there is a substantial number of oncologists who are interested in studying less intensive doses or schedules. Most recently, we are doing a trial with PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors in melanoma, first or second line, depending as indicated, with a view to stopping therapy 2 doses after maximal response, as opposed to going all the way to 2 years in a randomized setting. And we approached the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review organization, as well as ministries of health who fund things. In most countries, the regulator approves something, but the payer, which in our case is the provincial ministries of health, decides whether to fund it, because all they would need is really, they would save so much funding from avoiding giving even 1 out of 3 patients a full 2 years of therapy. It would fund the trial, but they just say it's not part of our role. And I think that's a big mistake. I think payers need to be investigating the gaps in knowledge that might improve efficacy, reduce toxicity and cost as part of their role. But that's hard to do. I would also say that for some other modalities, so for example, novel radiation technologies and techniques, the paradox there is you need to convince someone, whether it's a minister of health or a donor, to invest in purchasing the technology before you have the infrastructure in place to actually study it. And I'm thinking of things like the proton wave, which has now just officially hit Canada with approval for Princess Margaret to get a proton equipment. And everyone agrees theoretically this might make things less toxic, but given how we paint doses with radiation now and spare normal tissues, I think the jury is really out in how many situations it will really matter. And so that's the other side of it. Maybe the health ministries that are funding new technologies could also do so with an understanding that it will be supported, provided there are trials put in place to assess the value, in which circumstances it is of value. And years ago, we did that in Canada with PET scans. We had a randomized trial looking at 5 different areas in oncology where PET scanning might offer value. And I think in 3 of the 5 settings, it was positive and then approved for funding. And one of them, of course, was in lung cancer, looking for, occult metastatic disease. But that approach by the funder, the payer, the ministries of health has not been widely embraced, and I think needs to be, to add some intelligence. The other thing I was going to just say, Chris, is there's this virtuous, or maybe it's not a virtuous circle of buck passing, because, as an oncologist sees a patient who is wondering what next for their cancer, they know they're obliged to talk about something that was in the press last month as being approved. And the patient then assumes, well, if it's approved, it must mean that it would be good for me to take. And the patient thinks that because the regulator approved it. And the regulator approved it because the pharmaceutical firm and the oncologists who designed the trial say the differences we're finding are meaningful, so therefore you have to approve it. And it just goes around and around. Years ago, the FDA held a series of meetings to discuss which endpoints should be the basis of approval of new drugs. And I spoke at the ovarian cancer session for that. And it was really interesting because there was some really impassioned commentary that progression-free survival would be a surrogate for quality of life. And therefore, it should be used without there being any evidence that it was. And in fact, as it turns out, many studies have since shown it isn't. But they did try to get the information from the community about which endpoint made sense for approvals. But I don't think any agency has done that recently, really looking hard at the data. And that's why I actually think informed oncologists who are worried about this, and maybe even payers, maybe need to get the ear of the regulatory agencies and say, it's time for a rethink. We have an embarrassment of riches of therapies. When you look at population level outcomes and say, what difference is all this making? It's pretty hard to see, and we can't afford it. So we need to start being sensible and not squandering our health budgets on minimally active therapies at the end of life when other areas of health, such as prevention and mental health, are suffering so badly. So anyway, that's my little soapbox for today. Done.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Do I see any more hands up? So the question is really how to
John,
break.
I think Lisa's got her hand up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, sorry, I missed you.
That's okay. Chris, thank you for that really great presentation. And I concur with all the comments of all the people that have asked questions so far. I think it seems to me that you also mentioned about funding. And I think, to me, the problem we have is we haven't decoupled properly the funding cycle with the drug development process with the whole randomized controlled trial sort of landscape, drug development landscape, and then how that teases into the clinical practice arena and then cycles back again. All the while we've got vested interests financially in all of these sectors, I think we've got a bit of a problem on our hands. And it harkens back, as John Hickman will also agree, I think, that our conference that we organised back in 2019 in March, The Challenges Preventing Cancer Cure, the opening keynote lecture from Vinay Prasad pretty much was talking about man-made hurdles and obstacles. And every single one of your slides is talking about that, the fact that we measure the 20% decrease in diameter. Cancer didn't come up with that, it's humans. Who decided on what endpoints? Disease doesn't define that either, it's us. I remember distinctly Vince DeVita writing an editorial back in 2008, and he had a cartoon in it, and he basically said, yeah, we look at cancer and actually the enemy is us, it's not really the disease. And we fast forward well over 15 years and it hasn't really changed a great deal. So could you comment, given your key messages, the argument as well that patients, you say, expect better? I would make one change to your key messages, which are excellent. I would say they deserve better. They deserve nothing less, seeing as they're also largely funding all the research. Could you comment on whether or not we could get a completely altered infrastructure for funding that is decoupled from big pharma, where we have a completely independent clinical trials landscape and infrastructure that asks the necessary questions that you've alluded to, that appetite for 89% of trials currently being done by industry don't have?
Oh, so yeah, that's an easy solution, Lisa. No, I agree. Great question. I mean, I agree. A lot of these hurdles have been put in place by the system, which is driven by us. I think, as Elizabeth said, I think if we can make a stronger linkage between the payers and the research environment, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. I think that you could also, I mean, a number of people float this concept around that, you know, why is it that we let industry run their own trials, analyze their own trials, write up their own results? Maybe there should be an independent, you know, maybe they should provide the funding, but then it should go to a cooperative group that runs the trial independently, analyzes, designed it. You know, the company's job is to help develop the drug to a certain point, and then they can market and sell it later, but maybe they shouldn't also be in charge of running the trial. So I think that that's one potential, but I think that, you know, ministries of health worldwide are looking at their exploding budgets, and if I was ever at a seat at a table with a bunch of ministers of health, I would say, I think you need to spend a small amount of the money that you're deploying on healthcare actually to look about value. So we spend $1 billion a year on cancer therapeutics in Ontario, but almost zero at a provincial level to measure, are these drugs being adequately deployed and do they deliver in the real world? And I think, you know, I call this the 0.1% experiment. I've been kind of joking with leadership in Ontario, give me 0.1%, that's $1 million a year, it's a fraction. And then we can identify for those drugs that make a big difference, are patients actually getting them? Are the disparities, inequities, gaps in care? And the drugs that are at the bottom of the list, do they deliver or should they be removed? And so I think those are the conversations that need to happen.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everybody for a good discussion. I hope, as Ian said, things are moving, and I hope, Chris, that you feel things are moving in the right direction. There is incredible lock-in, really funded by the pharmaceutical industry and directed by them. I think the other thing that I saw was a breast cancer group in the States asking that Janet Woodcock not be brought to the head of the FDA because the standards of acceptance of drugs within the FDA had fallen over the last period that she was there. And I was greatly pleased to see that the patient groups were doing that. And I think that's another way perhaps that we can break this vicious circle. But anyway, thank you very much for a great talk, and I'm sure it'll cause a lot of discussion afterwards